the thing we were trying to do today was kind of continue and maybe both what you saw last evening and some of the earlier sessions where we're beginning to think about how beliefs are important or in terms of shaping decision making. And so this is a group of 3 economists, and we were joking with each other this is probably pretty obvious to you guys that culture and beliefs are pretty important in individual decision making. It took a bunch of economists a while to realize this. But what we've been doing is, and you'll see this collectively between the work, particularly both David and Nathan's work, on how we're beginning to put some structure and measurement to this and to see what we as economists and as people with more analytical tools can add to this. But the bigger question we're asking is, to what extent do beliefs and culture really matter? And more so, can these be factors which are shaped particularly by policy, and if so, in what way? And so with that sort of very quick introduction, let me just go straight to Nathan. We thought we'd just show you a bunch of pictures rather than showing you any text, because it's that time of the day where hopefully pictures are more easy to absorb. Okay.
Great. So it's great to be here. Can everyone hear me? So I'm just going to talk for 10 minutes, I guess, about cultural beliefs, values. And I think you guys have, over the last day or so, heard a lot about differences in beliefs and values and how these affect our behavior. So this map shows you one example of variation in beliefs and values around the world. And this is the belief or the cultural belief about the appropriate role of women in society. Okay, so and this is represented by female labor force participation rates. So the fraction of women that are in the labor force, and you can see it varies actually dramatically across countries. Green is where you have the lowest rates, under 40%, and then 70% or above is the red. And so you can see that just the extreme differences in a country like Iraq, only 15% of women are in the labor force. Other countries like Burundi, Tanzania, Rwanda, it's upwards of 90%. So we can try and understand this. We can say, well, people are just people. They're different. Societies are different. There's no logic to it, and that's it. Or we can say, well, let's actually try and understand how these societies got to be how they are and why there are such different beliefs about the appropriate role of women in society. The other thing I should say is I don't have data here, but it's been well documented that these correlate very strongly with people's self-reported beliefs. So if you ask them, if there's a shortage of jobs, should men have greater rights to work than women? And the answer to that correlates very strongly with this. Okay, so why are there these drastic differences across the world? So there's one hypothesis which has been around for a while, and this was developed initially by Esther Boserup. And this is that these differences are rooted in traditional agricultural practices. Okay? So there's 2 forms of agriculture that she looks at. One is plow agriculture. And this is plow agriculture here, where the soil is overturned using a plow, which is this large instrument that's often pulled by the individuals or pulled by animals. And overturning the soil brings nutrients to the top, kills weeds, creates furrows and rows that you can then broadcast seeds, and you can plow again to cover the seeds. And so you can contrast this form of agriculture. So you might say, well, what else is there? There's hoe agriculture. Okay? So this is typically shifting agriculture, slash and burn agriculture, and the main difference here is that the implement being used is a hoe rather than a plow. Okay? So what's the difference between these 2 types of agriculture and these 2 types of implements? The hypothesis is, well, the plow requires a lot of upper body strength, right? Requires a lot of gripping power. And the hoe, working with the hoe is not like it's not hard work, but it doesn't require the same amount of power and strength, whereas the plow is going continuously through the soil. The hoe, for anyone that's gardened, you're just moving a little bit of soil at a time. It doesn't require the same strength. So the idea is where you have the plow, men had a relative advantage for working out in the fields, and there was a gender division of labor. Men worked outside the home, in the fields. Women stayed within the homes. Where you had hoe agriculture, you didn't have that same division of labor historically. Okay? So then what she hypothesizes is, well, these norms or these beliefs might persist even after industrialization. So you're not even in agriculture anymore, but you just have these beliefs and these values that, well, this is the natural way for things to be, for women to be inside the home, not to be outside the home working. And so basically, I was curious. I remember reading this in grad school, this hypothesis. And so eventually, 10 years later, I actually got around to bringing it to data. So there is ethnographic data on whether societies traditionally in the pre-industrial period used the hoe or used the plow. And so you can link this to societies today by language. So this is a map. We have global coverage of languages around the world. So we know, and this is a map using ArcGIS software. We have about 8,000 languages and dialects that are mapped around the world. We also have from NASA at a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid cell level estimated populations around the world. So basically we know where people are and we know what languages they speak. We can link them to their ancestors by their language or by their ethnicity. Okay? And so this is, after a bunch of work, this is what a global map looks like. The lighter colored areas are where the ancestors of these individuals didn't use the plow, and the darker areas are where the ancestors did use the plow. Okay, so just to give you an example, this is the USA where you speak English, and so then we look at the English and what traditionally whether they use the plow in the pre-industrial period. This is the Portuguese, so Brazil where you speak Portuguese, and so that's kind of the logic, right? And so if you run the analysis, you could either take averages across individuals within a country or zoom in. There's a few really neat areas like Ethiopia. So in the highlands, they grow teff and they use the plow. You can zoom in using household survey data and look across individuals and test for this relationship. So basically what you do find is that areas or people that had ancestors that used the plow, you have lower rates of female labor force participation. There's self-reported beliefs about gender roles are less equal. You actually have strong differences in the sex ratio of children at birth. So this is most likely reflected in the sex-selective abortion. Differences in nutritional levels between boys and girls. So it's reflected in a whole host of factors. Okay? And so a natural question is, well, what causes plow use and non-plow use? This didn't drop from the sky. And there is actually a hypothesis about this as well, which we bring to the data, and it turns out it's supported. And this is that there are different types of crops, some that really benefit from the plow. And these are crops that are grown over vast expanses of land, deep soils that are flat, and you can use a plow very easily. And so wheat, barley, rye, teff would be examples. This shows you the parts of the world where that can be grown. And other ones like sorghum, millet, are ones that can be grown in more rocky areas and other areas where the plow cannot be used. So what you find actually is if you just take individuals, look at where their ancestors lived. If they lived where wheat could be grown relative to sorghum or millet, then they have the beliefs about gender equality are less strong today, actually. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to talk about is another example of where I think we can trace the historical evolution of culture and beliefs, and this is a big shock that happened within Africa, and this is Africa's slave trade. So between 1500 and 1900, you had about 20 million people which were enslaved and shipped outside of Africa. Okay, and so so I've studied this for a long time. The amazing thing about the slave trade, once you start looking into the records, so this is evidence from interviews by Sigismund Kelle in the 19th century, is how these individuals were enslaved. Okay, so what you find here is 20% report being enslaved by their friend or their relative or a family member. So they were tricked into slavery or thought a person was their friend, and it turned out they weren't such a good friend and they sold them into slavery. So I remember presenting this. I have some other research on this, and in the audience was a professor from southern Benin named Leonard Wanchikon, and he felt that he could really see the impacts of the slave trade in the area where he grew up, which is Cotonou, in people's interpersonal trust with one another. So we took this to the data. There are a number of surveys which ask people, how much do you trust your relatives, your friends, co-ethnics, non-co-ethnics? And basically what we did is link individuals to their ancestors and measure to what extent were their ancestors impacted by the slave trade. Okay? So how do we do this? Again, it's with ethnicity. Let me just skip that. And it's basically, this started in grad school, a lot of archival research. And so from primary and secondary sources, I collected a sample of about 100,000 slaves for which you actually know their ethnic identity. And so this is one example. This is slave registers from an archive in Zanzibar. And it's a list of slaves that were freed at the end of the 1900s. And so you can see it lists their age, their gender, and on the right, their tribe. So Nyasa is the tribe. And and slaves, when they were freed, were given something like this, which is a deed of freedom. Okay, so this person's name was Sharif Zaramo, and Zaramo was their ethnic identity. And so it was very common for ethnicity to be carried along with individuals through their last name. Okay, So with this, this is just visually using a map from George Peter Murdoch with the approximate location of ethnic groups within Africa. You have about 850. So this is for the Atlantic slave trade. The intensity, darker, means more people were taken from that ethnic group. This is the Congo Kingdom, probably one of the most well-known kingdoms in Africa. Another one is Shanti, for people that are interested. And then the Indian Ocean slave trade. Okay? And so here, basically, the logic was just people have their self-reported ethnicity. And we also ask them how much they trust in these surveys. And you find this strong relationship. And won't show you all the statistics. But the individuals whose ancestors were heavily enslaved during the slave trade, those individuals are less trusting today of those around them, including their family members. And the one striking thing we found actually was the erosion of trust was actually strongest amongst family members, friends and family, or those closest to them, which was something that actually surprised us. And the last thing that I'll just mention, talking about geography and, well, what caused the slave trade, you can see from here that it's clearly, if you were inland, you were protected to some extent by the slave trade just because transport costs to the coast were higher. And so what you find if you just look at the data within Africa, the more trusting people are inland, and this is the only continent in the world where you actually see this. And so that's very consistent with the slave trade having a big impact on this cultural trade. Okay, so basically, hopefully you can just take one point from the talk is that culture exists. There are cultural differences around the world. And I think we can explain it or think about determinants of it. And it does, my view is it does evolve in a systematic manner. And so we can start to try and understand it. Okay.
Great. So one of the things which is, so I'm going to talk about some work that I've done, which is very similar in spirit to Nathan, but very different in a different way, which is, so Nathan looks at two very important outcomes, right, which are both attitudes towards gender, which we think really affect workforce right now, or in general have huge implications on how we do business and so on and so forth, but also notions of trust. And these are two really, really big key factors in how we think about the development process or frankly, any aspect we can think of in the workforce. What I looked at is actually a different experience, but again, the same two outcomes. So I'm going to look at outcomes also on attitudes towards gender and also trust and tolerance of others. The event I'm looking at actually is a far more recent event, is a far more regular event. And so I'm going to have the audience think a bit about how is it that these forces that Nathan is talking about, which are really long-term forces, very persistent forces, which actually lead to pretty powerful effects. He didn't give you the magnitudes of these effects, but these are pretty large effects. Have a parallel in events that might be going through societies in general. The event I'm talking about literally happened 3 days ago. Happens every year. It's this. For those of you who don't know what this picture is, this is the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. Each year there are about 2 million Muslims who perform this, 2 to 3 million. I think this year was 2, last year was 3. So it's a pretty large event. And one of the fascinating things about this event is, for those of you familiar with Malcolm X has this, he writes fabulously, but he has this really fabulous letter he writes after he performs the pilgrimage to Mecca. And what he says is, he attributes this event, this kind of large gathering of people, to basically a lot of the attitude changes he experienced. So if you know Malcolm X's history, he moves from the Nation of Islam to kind of very mainstream Islam, and he attributes a lot of that movement, particularly his views on race. Now, if you remember Malcolm X's initial views on race, they tended to be somewhat not totally palatable with how we think about race these days. But what he says is, and I highlighted a couple of blue things, this is directly a quote from his letter. He talks about tens of thousands of pilgrims. They were of all colors, all participating in the same ritual, displaying a sense of unity. And then he says, what I've seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held. And in particular, what he's talking about is his views on race. He's very specifically referring to that. So the question we had as economists, this is joint work with Michael, who's a faculty member here, as well as David, is this a causal story over here? Is this just a reasoning someone is giving ex post to an event? Or do we truly think these events, which are not as long-term, not as persistent, not as deep as Nathan events, but kind of far more short-lived, a week basically, or 2 weeks maybe, could these events be equally as powerful in the way Nathan found his sort of experience? So just to give you a sense, so I don't know, by the way, how many, have you guys ever been, how many people have been in a crowd more than 1 million? How about 2 million? The Hajj itself. How about 50,000, 500,000? Right. What I wanted to share with you is just the visual impact that an event like this has. And so I thought I'll just show you a bunch of pictures. I just wanted you to focus on size over here, just to get a sense of scale. So this is just a close-up. These are kids, a kid performing the Hajj with his parents, presumably, all dressed in white. Just start focusing on, so this is the Kaaba, the kind of house where people circumambulate around. So just focus on the little black square and just keep going. So you can now see the scale of this event, right? This is literally, I'm just zooming out. So the experience, and so one of the things we're saying is, what is the experience of people when they're surrounded by literally millions of people? And there's another aspect which is very interesting of this event, which is diversity. What you see in this event is fascinating. You see a lot of color, but the color tends to be less about dress, although you see some colorful scarves, much more about skin and features and facial. So these are presumably Indonesians, these are South Asians, these are Africans, these are East Asians, Turks, and American women. This is actually an interesting documentary I think that PBS had, where they followed an American woman kind of through the process. So I want you to start thinking about the powerful visual experiences you're getting. One is the amount of people you're exposed to, and the other is the variety of humanity you're exposed to. And also there's very interesting, by the way, this is very unusual for those of you who know the Islamic culture. It's unusual to have genders mixing in a religious context. So this is a kind of unusual experience, but you'll see a lot of this. You'll see genders mixing a lot more with each other, and these are genders where they're not necessarily relatives to each other. So these are strangers, and you kind of, I mean, with 2 million people, I'd heard once there was an attempt to try and segregate in the event, but you can't really segregate 2 million people. It's just impossible. So this is a natural occurrence in the event. And you can see, I usually like playing this exercise where if you see a picture in some religious mosque, thousands of people praying, I kind of play a Where's Waldo, which is, can you find a single woman in the audience, in that crowd? And the answer is pretty much no. In these things, you'll see thousands of women and mixed together. And you know, there's a sort of fun picture on kind of globalization. This is my favorite picture. This is the Hajj from the 1950s. And you can see kind of the advent of global trends in this event. And so what is interesting for us was to say, follow people who experience this event. And the way we economists work on this, we want to get causal inference correct. So we rely on the fact that a lot of these countries have lotteries to have the event. So what you look at is you look at lottery winners who randomly get selected to go versus lottery losers who have the same intentions, the same life changes that they're going through, but didn't get to go because they didn't get selected in the lottery. So that gives us a very nice comparison group in the same way that you'd want to look at the effect of, you know, a drug to cure baldness or something. You know, similar, any medical trial would have a similar strategy over here. And what we find is fascinating, which is exactly along the lines of what Nathan said. We find, not surprisingly, you kind of get big religious movements. Now remember, in the psychology literature, you'd think these are adults, right? You'd think these are people who are typically 30 to 60-year-old. They've formed their belief, they've formed their attitudes. These are deep, fundamental principles they have. And this is an event where they're going to be exposed for 2 weeks in this large gathering. But what you find is, sure, they become more religious in a very particular way, by the way. They converge to what is mainstream global Islam. Right? That's interesting. But what is more interesting for us, and particularly in the context, like I bet if I did a little survey and said, what happens if you take a bunch of people and make them more religious? General in any religion, but in particular in Islam, my guess is you wouldn't have thought they would, A, become more tolerant, not just towards other Muslims, but actually towards non-Muslims as well. We find that. We have a lot of attitudinal questions, and we ask them general questions about trust and tolerance of others. Even people you haven't actually interacted with, and you find very positive effects on that. You also find fascinating effects on gender. So you find a much more positive movement on progressive gender attitudes, which is again surprising. There's a caveat to this: progressive gender attitudes which are permissible in the broad stream kind of religious context you have. And so the questions this is beginning to raise for us is, you know, what's the mechanism? What's the factor which is causing these large, very powerful movements within people? And what I'm going to do is kind of hand over, in some sense, to David, because as we're moving from what Nathan did to what I did, we're moving more and more to events which are, these are events you might say, well, this is part of some grand religious belief, it just happens. But as you're going to see from what David is going to talk about, he's going to talk about events which are very much events we create, experiences we create, and then see whether the same effects are showing up there. And if they are, then it starts raising questions for us, which is, to what extent can we consciously, as policymakers, come in and affect these powerful factors which we think we affect day-to-day behavior and interaction. So I'm just going to hand over straight to David, and then sorry, we're kind of rushing a tag team over here, but we want to get the kind of flow across each of these completely different papers and completely different research agendas to show you how powerful some of these features are. So David, he's going to talk about voting.
All right. Great. Thank you, Asim. So I'm an assistant professor at the Kennedy School, and there are going to be some similarities here, as Asim said, in terms of I'm going to shrink the time frame compared to Nathan. But I'm also going to be talking about social events, sort of mass social events. But the outcome is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to be looking at political beliefs and political behaviors, in particular when it comes to voting in democracies. So take the act of voting. Okay? So here's a picture of a voting booth in the US. There are two dimensions that I'm really interested in. One is sort of the political beliefs that shape who you vote for. So the policy platform that you vote for, what politician that you think has the right policy, what party that you support. Okay? So that's one dimension. The other dimension is really why you vote. Okay? So why do people vote? So this is a question that political science has really asked for a long time. And you really can't explain why people vote from sort of a standard rational model where people go to vote because they want to affect election outcomes. Because the likelihood that you're the pivotal voter that actually affects the election outcome is just so minuscule. Okay? So it has to be something else. And so the main explanation has been civic duty or citizen duty. Basically, the idea is that people feel that it's a civic duty as a citizen of this nation to actually go and vote. Okay? And we think that turnout and high voter turnout is, arguably important for a healthy democracy, right? So we think that the legitimacy of whoever gets elected is higher when a large share of the population is actually go out and vote. So it's something that we care about. Okay. So what I'm interested in is understanding sort of the determinants of this sort of citizen duty. And in particular, the sort of social and cultural processes that form national identity that then lead to civic duty of voting. And so in particular, I've been looking at National Day celebrations. These are large-scale mass social events that happen essentially virtually in all countries around the world. So basically all countries in the world have Independence Day celebrations at some point during the year. So here are some pictures from India celebrating independence from the British. You have from Mexico celebrating independence from the Spanish, Ukraine from the Soviet Union, and Ghana also celebrating independence every year. Okay. So as you can see, these are large-scale, typically very social events, often with a focus on children participating in various ways. So the testing ground for sort of the hypothesis that these events shape national identity that translate into how people sort of vote when it comes to elections, we're going to be using National Day celebrations in the US, in particular July 4th celebrations. These are also large-scale social events. Essentially all towns in America have them. There are parades through towns, fireworks, public barbecues, picnics, etc. Again, here there's a large focus on children. The participation levels among children is very high. And so the idea basically is, what's the effect of participating in these events as a child? Can it form a sense of national identity that translates into civic duty of voting as an adult? And so this is kind of tricky to get at from a methodological perspective, because basically, coming back to sort of how you want to ideally form, suppose you wanted to run an experiment where you want to test this hypothesis. Well, then basically you want to have cities or towns where you have this event and some other towns where you don't have that, right? Now that's very difficult to get at, but fortunately, nature gave us a pretty nice experiment. So it turns out that when it rains on 4th of July, so when it's heavy rain, many of these events are canceled. Okay? So that allows us to sort of use a natural experiment to test this idea that if towns celebrate 4th of July with parades, etc., does that affect behavior as an adult if children participate? And so when we look at this data, so we look at individuals born from 1920 throughout the 20th century, we find that sort of confirmation of this hypothesis. In particular, when there's nice weather on 4th of July, as a child, you're more likely to vote in elections as an adult. And in particular, you're also more likely to actually identify with the Republican Party, which we think is interesting because it's this idea that patriotism is associated with more right-wing beliefs. That was not the main hypothesis that we were sort of investigating, but it turned out to be the case. All right, so then I want to talk about a second study that I've done with some co-authors that looks at another type of social event, in particular political rallies and political protests. So if you think of 4th of July celebrations, as they're not explicitly political, right? It's a consequence of these events, but it's not sort of perhaps the main sort of intention. But what about these events that are massive, social, that have clear political goals? That's what political rallies do, right? So, and throughout history, we have seen political change being associated with political protest and rallies. So here's a picture from the March on Washington and the civil rights movement. We saw large-scale protests being associated with policy changes, political change. We've seen that in many other cases. More recently, of course, the Arab Spring sort of movement. We've seen large-scale political protests associated with political change. But it's really unclear whether the protests themselves actually caused any policy changes or political changes, right? So the alternative would be that this is just a sort of display of political preferences. So take the civil rights movement. What we saw was people demonstrating for this political cause. And maybe this is just a display. It didn't really influence anybody's political beliefs about, whether civil rights should be expanded to blacks. So what we do is we look at the Tea Party movement in the US, me and my co-authors. This is great because there's a ton of data that allows us to sort of look at mechanisms. And the Tea Party movement, as you know, is a conservative libertarian sort of movement promoting small government, lower taxes, etc. And so we were interested in whether these protests, so for those of you who are not perhaps super familiar with what happened with the Tea Party movement. So in 2009, on tax day, April 15th, 2009, that was really the start of the Tea Party movement. Okay? So after that, we saw super high growth in this movement. We saw the midterm elections, they had great success in the midterm elections, and now, of course, with the latest showdown, in Washington, that arguably is related to the Tea Party movement. But it's really unclear whether these protests had anything to do with it in terms of causing what we observed. So what we did is, again, we explored this natural experiment where if it rained during this tax day, actually turnout was very low. In many cases, they canceled the protest, or turnout was very, very low. So as you can see, so sort of that's kind of what we were looking at. So we looked at towns that had large protests due to nice weather, and compared it to towns that had small protests due to bad weather. And then we looked at a bunch of outcomes after these protests to see if it impacted the movement. And that's what we find. So in particular, through survey evidence, we find that local support in the general population for the Tea Party positions increase. So they're more in favor of Sarah Palin. They're more against raising taxes on incomes above $250,000. There's a greater sense of lack of freedom in the country, etc. There's more money that people donate to the Tea Party PACs. Okay? There's more media coverage of the Tea Party movement locally when there's a big protest. Then we look at election outcomes in the midterm election. We see a big increase for the Republican Party locally if there was a large Tea Party protest. Okay? And then ultimately we look at policy making. So we look at how congressmen in Congress vote on policy issues on the left-right dimension. Turns out that if they had a large protest in a given district, then incumbents are more likely to vote for the conservative position on a number of different policy issues, including Obamacare. So this is just a map showing you the protests that we were looking at. So just to summarize, I think there are sort of two lessons to be learned here that sort of resonate, I think, to some extent with Asim's point here, that these beliefs, political beliefs in this case, can really be moved in short time spans. So if you take the July 4th event, childhood experiences translate into adult beliefs and behavior. I think that there's also a lesson here about whether policy or interventions can affect political beliefs. So, the Tea Party protests, to some extent, they were sort of a grassroots movement, but of course there was a lot of funding going into these protests as well. And so I think the results sort of indicate that moving beliefs by having mass protests is sort of feasible. Then to the extent you want to do this or not, I guess it's a sort of to what extent you're interested in sort of political change and what kind of political change. But I think the results at least indicate that this is feasible.
I'll briefly just summarize a line of logic that is going through, and then we're happy to open up to questions, particularly ones where you think you want to challenge what we're saying or what is the provocative implications of what we're saying. But I think the broad stream of logic that this session was about, or panel was about, was starting by establishing in a very sort of stark way that very long-term historical beliefs or cultural aspects have, and these are hundreds if not more kind of beliefs which are formed that long ago, have strong effects today, so they persist. right? So that's one sort of very important finding, and we're seeing that over and over again, that there's a sense in which this historical legacy, literally the fact that you happen to have a certain crop versus the other, and that led you to have a hoe or not, could have strong implications on how we're going to deal with women in the workforce. I mean, these are at some level depressing thoughts that we have to have such persistence, but another level recognizes how powerful these forces can be. At the same time, I think what Nathan's work is suggesting in his entire body of work and others is that is the case, but that these beliefs actually move to rational pressures. This isn't a random process. The way these beliefs and cultures evolve, there is some logic to it. There is some sense to it. So there is some predictability. Not a whole lot, but there is some predictability. Nathan can talk more about that. But then I think the work both that I presented and that David showed suggests that it's not just that these are historical legacies, that these features can actually move in the short run as well. In fact, they're events, whether those be events which are created as part of your general belief system or events that we have created, like protests or movements, that these events, or whether you got exposed. I mean, it's fascinating that the fact that, what David's work is that the fact that you got exposed as a child to 4th of July, literally at that period when you think, well, this was a long time ago, this affects how you view yourself as an adult. And not just how you view yourself, but how you decide on serious issues about civic participation or civic duty. And if these forces are so powerful, then the question that we pose in some sense to ourselves as people who study the development process is, to what extent are these policy levers? To what extent should we be aware of these? Should we be, when we decide policies or when you guys are deciding policies or interacting even in the commercial spaces you might be in or the policy spaces you might be in, to what extent should we think of these as levers or things which exist that we have to work around? I think that's kind of the big questions we're beginning to grapple with in the field. So I'll stop at that and I'll kind of open up if there are people who have questions, concerns, comments. We're happy to kind of take some.
I can give you a comment on the 4th of July, coming from my experience when I was living in this country in the 60s. I was at that time more sympathetic to the extreme left part of the Democratic Party, who was never participating at that time on the 4th of July. I don't remember who the author was, but somebody in the Yale psychology department was working at the time, and you probably can find the research, that basically the political opinion of a person is formed by age 5. So definitely, if that is true and still holds today, there's no doubt that the parents who are taking their kids to the 4th of July have indoctrinated them by the time they're 5, and it's consequently they vote that way later on.
So, should I respond now? So there is a big literature called the political socialization literature, sort of that crosses, I think, political science and psychology, that really pursues this hypothesis that childhood experiences, socialization during childhood really forms political beliefs and political behavior. Now, in terms of like empirical evidence, I think that's been very scarce because you have to measure what happens during childhood, and then you have to trace what happens as an adult. And not only that, you also have to have some kind of experiment at the childhood level, right? It's not sufficient just to look at what kind of environment that you grow up in, because growing up in Texas, say, in a conservative environment is very, very different from growing up in like Manhattan, right? And so you don't really know, it's very difficult to get at the issue of causality. So what we look at in terms of then what years during childhood that you seem to be most susceptible to this, it seems like broadly speaking, from 7 to 12 is sort of when you're most influenced by these 4th of July experiences. There are no effects for younger kids, and there are very weak to no effects for later years.
I mean, to wear a different hat, which is work Ricardo alluded to, is so I do this work on trying to figure out whether you can do personality profiling of entrepreneurs, basically. And are there traits which you can pick up which capture entrepreneurship? And one of the interesting questions in that literature is exactly the same, which is there a sense in which entrepreneurship as a culture, as an attitude, as a personality attribute is also crafted at a very early age? And how do we begin to think about that? So I think some of these forces, in addition to, David's work is just looking at political attitudes, but it seems like a lot of the domains that we engage with as professionals, there's a real question to what extent are our abilities in those domains captured by what we experienced as a child. Go ahead.
And the other two, because Nathan shows these very long time scale continuities, and yet you guys show very short time scale changes. You'd think that that would create sort of diffusive changes that would just blur everything together. And I wonder, I mean, I have some ideas about this, but I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this.
Yeah, so I think that's a great observation.
He just thinks our work is wrong, basically.
Yeah, that's right. So I think both can be happening. The world's a very complex place, and I think as economists we tend to oversimplify and push one story versus the other. And I think when you start to look at magnitude, so think of all the variation in attitudes about women across societies today. How much does this history of agriculture explain? It's less than 4%, right? So there is this strong statistically significant relationship that you can identify, but you're not explaining all of the variation, right? So things like income levels, actually per capita income is much, much more important. So the question is, how do we spur that? That's the big question. So I think there are, so this says that there is some persistence over time, but it's not 100% definitely. So in my mind, that's how we can reconcile the two. I don't know if this was consistent with the thought that you had, or.
I mean, I think your data at the national level is extremely coarse for measuring long-term persistence, and I think work by people like Ruth May suggests that normative persistence is actually quite a bit stronger and longer than, I mean, it's not the data you guys would like, but so I think it's a real puzzle, actually. And I think if I were trying to explain it, I would think of spatial averaging of some kind. These are all local effects. Yours are much wider spread effects. You have some kind of bird-type disadvantage process that tends to squeeze out the minorities. That would, I think, could reconcile these things. But
I mean, the one thing I think where we find, which we both agree on, is that what is powerful for us is that it's got to be that given that we have very small movements in beliefs at one level, the fact that we find these things to affect real outcomes or real decision making must suggest that these are extremely powerful forces. Now, whether you can harness them in a way that you can change them substantially, even if you change the bits and pieces of them, you seem to be getting large movements. And I think that stage to us is, to be honest, my prior was that they would be not as big as what we find them to be. And so, but I agree with you. Maybe it's all kind of, who knows how you can move them.
Well, obviously the epistemological question, I deal all the time with opinion polls, and I just wanted some more details as to, I live in a place where if somebody comes up to ask your opinion, your first question is, do you work for the government or not?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you want to know if I trust anybody? Do I trust you? In other words, just do you do it on a scale to 1 to 10? What is the size of the sample? You know, the simple kind of statistical thing that you would ask. Just how deep, for example, was your research with people from the Hajj? Did you look at introversion, extroversion? Did you look at whether they went with family groups or non-family groups? And in your case, social trust, was that just a standard social trust thing that you got, or did you create your own specific to tribal area or specific to the nature of the community you were working with?
So I can answer. So we obviously presented a version of our work which was like, 1/100th the length of what it should have been. So a lot of these details, I think you're exactly right. There's a challenge in this, and I think we're adding hopefully some value to that, not just us, but kind of the literature, which is about measurement, about elicitation of these things. I think the challenge has been that these things have been extremely hard to measure for the lots of reasons that you said. And this is stuff you probably heard Dick Taylor talk about last evening as well, is that we've made substantial amounts of progress in elicitation in ways which aren't suffering from the obvious biases. That doesn't mean that we have got great elicitation. I can talk about sort of in my work, and then Nathan and David maybe can mention briefly as well. In my own work, what we typically tend to do is so the results I showed you are like 10 to 15 different ways of asking the same question, each with their own biases, and we give you indices of results. We don't give you one question because it doesn't make sense. It could just be a random aberration. But the other thing which we find when you ask are the defects different, what I find interesting is the deeper question for me in the work like this is, what is a mechanism which is causing about these changes? You can describe the event, but what actually happened? For instance, in the Hajj case, would you get the same effect happening if you took a bunch of Muslims and put them in some larger gathering which wasn't religious? So we all go to Disneyland or something. I don't know, but my guess is not, because what we find is the exposure is much more powerful for smaller groups. And so our mechanism, which we think is happening, is literally exposure to diversity of people. And that happens if you go in a smaller group of people, you tend to interact with many more outsiders than you would have normally. And those guys have a particularly larger effect. So there's some evidence that these mechanisms of exposure are really powerful. Exposure to different attitudes, different beliefs, different types of people. I don't know, Nathan, if you wanted to add.
Yeah. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with the difficulty, particularly when you're measuring and quantifying culture. So what's the best measure is, well, you could say, oh, well, you ask somebody, their beliefs, but there's these issues. Well, you bring them into the lab and they play a trust game where they have to trust the other person, and you see how much they're going to trust them. Then you say, well, that's completely artificial. What does that correspond to in real life? So in the Plow paper, basically we look at, and much along the same lines as Asim, a whole bunch of outcomes, but we actually look at a lot of objective outcomes which we see in the real world. So if we think of people's attitudes about women, are women in positions of political power? So we actually look at measures, and this is why at the country level, one benefit of the representation of women in national parliament. Or we have survey data and look at the fraction of firms in each country that are owned by women, for example. And so, that, and also these attitudes and female labor force participation and, the stature of children, sex ratio of children at birth, these sorts of things. But it's very difficult to say, how do we optimally quantify culture? And this is,
I think we've gotten so I hope you guys enjoy this. We're happy to talk more, but I think the bottom line is over here that, we'd like you guys to think a bit about how these forces play in your environments, and to what extent do you think there are features in your environments which actually can cause these to move in directions which hopefully are socially desirable. So I'll leave with that, and thank you so much.